Hello, I'm Alex Totaro.
And I'm Alex Goldstein.
We're a pair of TV nerds with opinions, and this is the thing that gets you to the thing, a Halt and Catch Fire fan podcast.
This week, we're on season 1, episode 3, called High Plains Hardware, which means we've got some new characters to reckon with, writing by Jason Cahill, and another director who cut her teeth on the big screen, Karyn Kusama.
You know the drill by now. We're watching episode by episode on Amazon Prime, and we think you should too.
Okay then, let's chew over what the engineers think. So, this week, a big change, or not change of direction, but a big shift for the show, because we've gone from 2 episodes written by Christopher C. Rogers and Christopher Cantwell, who are also showrunners, created the show, and directed by Juan Jose Campanella. And now we shift to a new writer. So Jason Cahill came from The Sopranos and Fringe to write this episode. And then Karyn Kusama, who is probably best known for Jennifer's Body, so massive cult hit, has obviously worked on like Aeon Flux, and her debut was Girl Fight. Often has very strong feminist leanings, very strong female characters, and interesting that she was brought in because there's quite a few female directors working on *Halt and Catch Fire* as we go through the season. She's the first of quite a few.
Sure.
Really interesting that they give her what is essentially, I think, a strong Cameron episode. So yeah,
I think it's well. You know how I felt about this episode. This wasn't my favorite episode. I felt like a lot of things got sort of diverted or derailed in this episode in a way in relation to that sort of neat chapter that we had with episodes 1 and 2. However, I can totally respect sort of the director's vision for this episode. And one of the key things for me watching was that you could sort of still understand the basis of that camera work and that cinematography that was sort of planted on episodes 1 and 2. And the look of the show, we already touched on this quite a lot. It's solid, it's strong, and she's able to sort of tweak that and enhance it where need be. So I think we're gonna invert this week's structure and actually dive straight into the camera work, because I think we both thought that was the strongest bits of the episode in a way.
Yeah, I think I feel a little bit more charitable towards the episode than you do. I felt a little bit happier with some of it, but for me, the really strongest standout thing is that the camera starts moving a bit more and starts doing some interesting things.
The camera finally moves, and this is something that's actually strange to say out loud, because the first 2 episodes, the camera was so focused on the characters or the setting that you didn't really notice because everything was well put together. We talked about the editing being really sort of on point. And in this one, it moves, but sometimes it's also very subtle. It'll be something like Donna leaving her boss's office and the camera just slightly pans and she walks out of the room. And that's quite interesting because what it does is essentially destabilize the scene when you have those general shots. And we'll talk about that destabilization versus the tight focus on the close-ups. But whether it's done to continue underlining some of the symbolism that we're seeing throughout, or because it doesn't feel like something that was just style. Once again, it feels like it was done with purpose. It follows our key characters. And something that we're going to touch on that I think has a lot to do with, obviously, this camera work and maybe why the camera starts moving a little bit more is because our 4 main characters actually interact with loads of new characters and groups of characters that maybe get in the way of where the focus or the action should be. It's interesting hearing you say that this is a Cameron episode. For me, it was actually a Gordon episode.
I mean, maybe both. And it's funny because Joe does the most standout, like, oh, wow, things in it. And yet I don't really remember him very much because so much of his arc is about throwing hissy fits that I kind of don't really remember very much of what's going on with him in this episode. He's just being really destructive. But okay, so one to take us back to the camera work a second, I guess the theme of the whole episode for me, and I think from what we've said, you agree on this, is the whole thing is about pecking order, right? Everyone
Yeah.
is in multiple arguments with everyone else about where they stand. And particularly when you've got really big egos like Joe's. And Cameron is very uninterested in getting in a pecking order fight with anybody, but that's partly because she considers herself in a whole different category and better
Yes.
maybe than other people. So you've got these kind of
Well, she's
multiple.
doing something completely different.
Yeah, she just feels like she's somewhere else, right? So we've got all these. So I tried to kind of map them out somewhat. So it was like Joe versus Boz and Lulu, Cameron versus Gordon, but it's only Gordon that's playing. So at the end of that scene where he kind of goes, "She took my soda," it's like it's
Yeah.
clear that Gordon is the only one who's actually concerned about this. And then Joe,
Yeah.
sorry, Donna versus Hunt, and then Mark, and then Gordon versus the engineers, and Boz versus Joe, and by extension Nathan. So what that does to the camera work is you start getting these wonderful. I really did love this. You get these wonderful off kilter angles where everything looks like the Titanic listing. Everyone's fighting to the death, and you're like, what are you even fighting for? This whole ship is sinking. No one knows what
Yeah.
they're doing. You're firing people left, right, and center, and everything's going to hell. But that wonderful, like the first appearance of it, I think, is where Joe and Boz have their first sort of standoff. And in that particular fight, Boz wins the fight. But you go into the scene, everything's off kilter. Joe is at a funny angle. They work out this conversation with this external investor, and Boz is at the edge of every shot. So everyone's in triangles, and Boz is always kind of on the outside. And then he very deliberately screws things up. Like he hears about Roger and he's not having it, and he screws it up. And that's the first time that Boz is then allowed into the close up sort of nature. And it's just
Yeah.
the camera is just whizzing around them and doing these amazing things. I absolutely love it.
I think it's so cool to have that element play into the episode to actually make to make it stand out, to make it a little bit stronger. And you're right; those general shots tended to be a lot more destabilized, and we saw a little bit of that in episode 2, where the camera sat in the middle of the boardroom, etc. But this is kind of taking that to the next level. And I love your observation on, for example, Boss he sort of wins that argument, or he wins that scene, and the close up on him is completely sort of centered. And we do see a lot more. Again, maybe this is because of the dynamics between the characters, but also the new characters introduced. But you get a lot more close ups of everyone versus the general 2 and 1, and someone sort of off the scene, but you can still see their silhouette or something like that. So I thought that was great. We also they continue to play around with Cameron's office, which I really like. They have that sort of rail, and they really use that to sort of separate the characters. And one of the things that I think is great, especially when it comes to Cameron, is very much like her, who can't be kept in and has to be flying around all over the place. The camera is always showing us different parts of that space, even though it's a really confined space, right? So by going from one side to the other, they really allow us to almost target in on their faces and on their characters. And I feel like this was an episode that really highlighted expressions and reactions, which is more than we've gotten before. I think before it was like, you did this and I'm going to jump into that, but now it's kind of like it's deeper cuts.
Yeah, and Cameron also gets a unique piece of camera work. So the off kilter thing is largely used for Joe, but not uniquely. But for Cameron, I think she's the only one that gets these sort of slow mo sequences around her
Yeah.
where she's thinking, and so the world slows down around her to allow her mind to go faster than everything else around her. And I do have to, I lolled a little bit at the lipstick scene because I'm like, I'm sorry, but that lipstick would have broken after that very first line. You cannot make lipstick last for that long. That woman went through like 10 lipsticks. But
It's Hollywood lipstick.
It's Hollywood lipstick, lasts forever. But she gets these slow-mo scenes where her brain is working at a different pace from everyone else's, and it just further separates Cameron as a person from the other three. So you have it underscored in her interactions with people where she just kind of refuses to get into conversations with people about things that she thinks she knows better. She wafts in and cuts Gordon off when he tries to talk to her. And it's like, no, total separation. She is trying to keep herself cut off, but like physically just in the thing that you just mentioned with the fence, but also in these slow-mo scenes, everything about the camera work, everything about the direction is enforcing that separation. And I did think that was extremely clever.
And Cameron, and well, on that scene also, she's not only that's a great observation. She's not only sort of in this slow motion pace or whatever, but also the people that it's like that white noise. It's not the same as Cardiff Electric, which is
Yeah.
full of engineers and people pressuring her.
And they're not trying to compete with her. They're on their own level doing their own thing. Like they're actively trying to disconnect almost in a kind of self-conscious way. And she undermines the guy where she's like, oh, the guy wants a car, but he also wants to be this kind of anarchist thing. So she jokes about it, but she loves that they don't want anything from her other than a space to party and some booze.
And
like they're not asking her for anything that really costs her anything but money. It's for her, it's a blessed relief.
I mean, she's just walking out with that paycheck, so she knows the value of her work now, right? It's almost that underlining this is not why I'm doing it, but look, like I'm a valued member of the marketplace.
Yeah. And actually, we did a calculation, didn't we? So actually, it wasn't us. So fair play to us. It was a friend of the podcast. We did a little paycheck calculation for us on what Cameron's actually earning.
Yeah, so apparently she gets her first check of $382.67, which translates to $927 in 2016 money, in 36 cents. And her $40,000 salary a year would be close to $97,000 a year, which is not bad.
It's not bad for her age. I'm going to say it's not extraordinary, totally. But not bad for her age. So she has done some good negotiation on her behalf, but you can also see why she would be looking at this like, holy crap, I've got money in my pocket. She doesn't have any sort of semblance of like a traditional working life up until then. And so even when we go home to Gordon and Donna's house, as we have done in previous episodes, it's all very suburban. And when you've seen into Joe's flat and it's all very cold and like yuppie-ish, Cameron doesn't have a house. She has a hotel room that she gets on a whim because she's told that she can't sleep in the office by a man who we later find out is sleeping in the office.
Is sleeping in the office. No, and the great thing about Cameron is that, I want to talk about that scene in a second, but also the sort of, like, it's your first paycheck, but with a high salary. And it's almost like, oh, what can I get with it? Like, suddenly things that you didn't know you wanted, you could get. And that's that freedom of like, oh, I'll help you guys out and let's just crash a hotel room.
Yeah. And what does she get? A hotel room, some Twinkies and vodka. It's like she doesn't have she's not interested in all the markers of status that everybody else is. Like Joe has the perfect statement in his house and his car. Donna and Gordon have kind of built the expected suburban life next door to next door to the other engineer who also lives in this little boxed little world. Everything is kind of perfect lawns and, dead birds, as it turns out. But Cameron's she's got none of those markers. She is interested in a place to sleep, stuff that powers her, and having all she wants to do is power her mind to do these things.
Yes.
And I like that little insight into her.
So this goes hand in hand with the caramel work, but some of the lighting elements with Cameron are also very, very interesting. And I'll point out two different scenarios that stood out to me. The first was when she got that paycheck, and it's actually the first time we see her outside in town in sunny day sunlight.
Yeah, that's true, because the only other time we've seen her has been in the mall, which is artificial, enclosed. God, you're right. That's a good observation.
Or right outside the arcade or something where she's getting chased by Joe. And there's a lot of night scenes in *Halt and Catch Fire*, which you don't really think about until you have these contrasting scenes. So you're right. There's so much artificial lighting that I was sort of like, oh, wow, they're outside. Like they let her out.
Because everybody's so busy working on everything that you never actually see them interact with the natural world, or at least not very often.
Well, especially her, where she is in that dungeon working nonstop. And actually, that beginning scene of everyone's beginning shot, that parallel of them waking up and like their different routines and how they are. Even that's kind of like 5 in the morning sunrise versus this sort of like broad daylight of, oh, actually I'm just on my lunch break or whatever. You don't see that. And the second instance was when she's dancing around the office and she sneaks into boss's office. There's very harsh lighting on her head. So you have like this dark office with very very harsh white lighting, and obviously her hair is very very white. So that's like I don't know if that's like a light bulb switch moment where it's just like, aha, I have this idea, or something else. But
I did not notice that. Well spotted.
well, that's what these eagle eyes are doing right now as I'm rewatching because, again, not happy with the narrative on this one at all. But other than that, and also I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned so far Lee Pace's bare ass in the first scene for our Lee Pace appreciation minute of the podcast.
I mean, I think Lee Pace should have an appreciation minute every day, not just in this podcast, and not just for his rear end, obviously.
Sure.
He's a marvelous actor, and seems like a very nice person. But yeah, that was a moment for us all. But it just goes to show how. It just goes to show how weird this episode is in many ways. That. Yes. I saw it, I registered it, and then I forgot about it because there's a lot going on. There is a lot going on. And with Cameron, not only do we get the kind of slow-mo bits, but when she interacts with other people, the editing also goes really high pace. So it's like when she's alone, the whole world is in slow motion around her because she's thinking and her brain is going at its own speed. When she's with other people, everything speeds up to go with her because everyone around her has to keep up with her. And that on its own is kind of like there's so much going on in your head that other little incidental moments just kind of drop off the radar.
And to be fair, those moments don't seem to add much to, like, they try to continue building these characters, right? They try to say like Joe is this Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, high-end CEO of something, and his routine is probably I don't know, meditating under a waterfall at 5 a.m. type person, right? Versus Donna and Gordon, who have to like get up to fix. Yeah. They can't help the bird while take the girls to school while picking them up for practice and the usual stuff. So I do like that the show is doing these parallels. They're basically continuing to connect these characters without being so over the head with it. But yeah, I mean, it is really interesting to see Cameron step outside of that, because even when Gordon and Donna are waking up, like, we don't know what time it is, but the day seems grim, it seems cloudy. Again, there's no moment of sunshine, there is no moment of sort of relief on that. So I thought that was quite an interesting one. And it's really funny that Boss was also sleeping in the office, and you sort of wonder why. And we'll get into that when we talk about a little bit more about the narrative. So do you have any what other thoughts sort of stood out to you, knowing that this was a different director when watching the episode?
For me, mainly it was the change of pace in those things. The other thing, in terms of like direction, I don't think I noticed that much more than that. I think in writing, there were a few things that I noticed.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can move on to that for a second, I think one of the reasons I liked those Cameron scenes so much is actually she doesn't say very much. And so the directing and the editing take the floor, and it works really, really well. Once people start interacting, there are a few bits of writing that I bumped on quite hard. There are some that work brilliantly well, but there's, particularly when Donna speaks, quite a lot of like slightly heavy-handed exposition going on. So right at the beginning, I noticed, like, when she's having this conversation with Gordon and they're trying to work out their various morning routines, and she's like, but you can't do that, not while your car is in the shop. And it's like, oh my God, like, do you, like, it just felt like she was explaining his life to him, like a real life married couple wouldn't have to explain your car is in the shop. He already knows that. But there was that. And then
Gordon, he does, but he doesn't he hasn't listened either.
No, that's true. And I mean, if it had just been that line, I don't think I ever would have noticed
fair,
it. But it
fair.
surfaces again when she's talking to Hunt. Now, we'll talk in a minute about how many guest stars we have in this episode, because we have an embarrassment of riches going on here.
Yes.
But they introduced Scott Michael Foster, who, just for a minute, I have to say, I love this man. He is, I mean, I could talk about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend for a whole other podcast, but he is one of my favorite things in it. But they introduce him, and then the backstory is like spoon-fed to you really fast. Like, we're friends, we had a history, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of things, underlying all that. It's like, whoa, this is like 3 episodes worth of discoveries in 10 seconds. And then he has to, and then they have this awkward like positioning thing where he has to be a friend and a boss. And all of that is packed into a scene that's not particularly long. And then when you add that to the kind of car and the shot comments and things like that, it just feels like there are bits of this episode where, and I don't necessarily think you can point to the writer and go, it's your fault. I feel like they had a lot that they had to get through to get to something else. Like, we don't obviously know what's going to happen in the next episode or whatever, but it feels like they were told, can you make this work in an hour? And they just had to jam that stuffing in there.
So I think I agree with you, and in terms of the Donna situation, you do have episodes that I think cater more to one character over the other, and I like that style because I feel like it really allows them to breathe. I mean, we've all seen Game of Thrones, guys. We've all seen Downton Abbey. Like,
I haven't seen Game of Thrones, but that's a thing for another. That's a conversation for another time. But I know what you mean.
The best episodes were the ones that focus in one location. You know, the episode 9s of every season. And this is not that. Obviously, you don't have 1,000 characters with a thick British accent, but you do have to sort of pick your lanes. I think the episode tries to plant some seeds onto Donna and really show that. What her work life is. And actually, one of the things that stood out to me when the episode started was Donna looks nice. She looks fancy. That's the first time ever I've seen her dressed up to like go to work. And you don't know if she's having a meeting. You don't know if she's having an interview. And we obviously found that in the previous, in the pilot, that she obviously doesn't get paid as much. And it's kind of disappointing to see her just be like a glorified secretary. However, the whole point is how underrated she is.
Yes. And interesting that this is the episode where we finally have confirmation of something that we have suspected for 2 episodes now, which is that she can do engineering.
Yes.
Like, they mention it, they drop it in there that you're like, oh, she actually does know what she's doing. She's being paid like 25 grand less than Cameron to be treated like a little bit of a sort of, there's a hint of Office Space in it where he's like, where's that report? Like, if you could just get that TPS report, it's kind of, there's a hint of kind of micromanagement and like mid-level management going up and people getting opportunities that she won't get. And then you get her mother, the luminous Annette O'Toole, who just blasts into that scene. And again is handed like 3 years worth of exposition in 30 seconds, where she's like, oh, the foreign wife. Oh, look at all these opportunities. The foreign wife who's Canadian. I did like that line. Fair play. But, look at all these opportunities that you won't have. And can you stand by your kitchen sink, which we may as well chain you to make this point a little bit more heavy-handed?
But also, can you make Gordon also do the dishes every once in a while? And don't tell him that we're giving you money because we know he don't like that. And it's like, okay, we've suspected this all along. I mean, the difference between, these are all, in a way, stereotypes. Not that a mother would be a stereotype or a boss, but in a way, it's kind of like, I'm your mom, so I have the right to tell you to look after yourself, and you're looking a bit knobbish. But one of the things that I liked was that I know we're jumping all over the place when it comes to guest stars, but one of the things that we're doing the same thing the guys did in the episode. One of the things that I liked
it's their fault. It's too messy.
Exactly, it's too messy. One of the things that I liked about the mom was when she was like, "You look a bit knobbish," and Donna was like, "Do what?" She was like, "No, you look radiant as ever." She's not like a harsh mom from that point of view. She's not sort of like, "You're never good enough." Actually, it's the opposite. It's, "Donna, you're so good. Why do you put up with this stuff?" And then you go into the scene.
You're better than this.
Yeah, and then you have these work scenes that also are a massive contrast to Cardiff Electric. And Cardiff Electric is still a very corporate environment, and we'll find that out through later episodes as well. But it's a very corporate environment, so it's not like one is any better. You're not getting any hints of like just because Donna's helping out with the design of, in a way, the design of the computer doesn't mean that suddenly it's going to be like, oh, hold on, can Donna go and work on the other side and like be treated like Cameron is? And like, no, because it doesn't really make a difference. And the last guest star while we're here is Jean Smart, who is life.
The amazing Jean Smart.
She's so good, and she's so
oh
cliched in this episode.
Again, she has to do a mountain of character development in no time at all, but she does it so well.
But yes, but I feel like this is where it really falls short, because she's like this investor. Her name is Lulu, so you can tell that it's more friendly and more like Southern maybe than the guy that Joe brought in the morning, right? And I don't know. It just with her, I get the impression that I mean, Joe said it right. Like, you're this loser that rents her friends and doesn't have anything better to do than invest in these companies. But the thing that stood out to me,
he's so like, we know that he doesn't hold back from yelling at anybody. We know that he's yelled at Gordon, this and that, the other.
The stereo guy that sold the stereos.
But I don't think we've ever seen him speak. We've seen him speak in anger and frustration. I don't think we've ever seen him speak with this much contempt before. And that is really fascinating because, I don't know if he would speak to another man with that level of contempt.
No, probably.
Like, he really is quite disgusted by her, which I find fascinating. But
I mean, he's so disgusted that he crosses the line, doesn't he? But
big time, yeah.
The thing about not only him calling her out and to be honest, like, without any background, just, I mean, sure, she sort of like stepped in a very brash way, but Joe actually needs to realize that this is what he's got to deal with. He's flying people in. When the guy in the morning was like, "It's nice to see you again, Joe," it's like, yeah, another person that you're flying in to sort of bring your world onto where you are now. And he doesn't mention the Silicon Prairie, which I loved. But that's not the person he'll be doing business with. The person he'll be doing business with is this woman who is so far removed from the environment that it could really derail the operation. Now,
and he can't act out against Boz, because this power play is really about who's in charge, right? Nathan makes it very clear that, Boz is in charge. He does the financials and Joe does everything else. And Joe has agreed to this. Like, he sat there at lunch being like, agreed. He pouts. He literally pouts and then goes, okay, agreed. It's fine, because he can see a way around it. He's like, oh, I'll work out my way around it. And he meets this woman who at first is like, if it had just been her, if Travis hadn't been there for him to be able to circumvent her, like, she would have won that fight. And really, he's trying to win a fight with Boz. And she's the kind of collateral damage of the whole thing. And that there's so much going on there.
I didn't remember that dynamic. I did not remember when I watched it through the first time, the Boss Joe dynamic, because to me, they never felt in the same level. And actually surprised that Boss was in it from like episode 1, which is great. Because we said it last episode, right, that he's such a balancing act. And this is why maybe it's one of those leads that the writers were putting in there around, like, is this going to be a thing? Like, is Joe going for his job? And actually, when you think about it, Joe's got bigger fish to fry, doesn't he? And so it's kind of like, how do you allow this to breathe in a way that's more character development than actually furthering a narrative that you don't know if it's going to make sense by the end of the season? So Joe crossed that line. Let's talk about that line, actually.
He did. And in some ways, I feel underqualified to talk about this bit, because I feel like we maybe need somebody to come in as a guest who is gay or bi to talk about how this is handled. But suddenly we find out something about Joe that we didn't know, which is that he has this interest in men. It's weird
I mean,
because
but hold on, I'm gonna stop you there. Does he have interest in men, or is he so manipulative that he doesn't care what he's
this is it.
doing?
This is it. And it's kind of undercut immediately at the end of the episode where Cameron turns up and kind of whips her top off and wanders into the bedroom and he just follows. Well, he doesn't follow, he stands there, but you know he's going to. And it's
Yeah.
like, so what are we actually saying about Joe's sexuality here? Are we saying that he's so interested in winning that he doesn't care? Are we saying that there's a whole underlying layer to Joe that we don't know anything about? Like the way it's handled, in some ways, they do the grand tradition of the show, which is to drop something in and then not talk about it in the way that they kind of dropped feminism in but didn't talk about it in the first couple of episodes. And so that does chime with the way that these things are handled in the rest of the show, but it feels like it's quite a big thing to just kind of go, just drop and then leave. And it's weird because there's this big act that happens and it derails all the thing and it gets him back into like sparring position with Boz and all the rest of it. And yet 2 minutes after I'd watched the episode, I'd sort of forgotten about that and I was still thinking about Donna with the spade in her hand and Cameron and the slow-mo around her and even to some extent Gordon, yeah, going on this journey from being so kind of pathetic that he couldn't fire people and have them know that he was firing them,
Ugh.
all the way through to kind of like busting his head open and being like, yeah, whatever, you're fired, get out. So
I think on the Joe thing, there's a reason you didn't really capture it when it happened. And I think it's because it wasn't subtle, but it was so like this is not a big deal
Yeah.
that if it flowed through. And I think
I don't know whether
it
that's
was-
good or
it
bad
was
though.
really fun.
That's what I can't get my head around. Is like, is it good
I
that
think-
it's
well,
dropped in as
I
not a
think
big
it's-
deal because it shouldn't be, or is it bad in the sense that the episode's so messy that you don't know what's important and what isn't?
I think it's good because you don't look. If it was a different type of implementation, no matter how messy the episode was, you would have Joe doing that, and maybe Boss maybe looking for something. So he looks in and closes the door and is horrified because we're in Texas
God,
and
yeah.
God forbid.
The last thing you
So
want is like soap opera territory. That would just be awful.
But also, Travis came out with a different wine or a different beverage.
That line is like full fair play to Cahill. That line is beautiful. We decided on a port. I mean, I want that on a t-shirt.
And
that line is just superb.
And the thing with that is Joe is so influential that he continues to do what he thinks is God's work in letting people choose or choosing for them what they think they should be doing. So you have this man.
Mother knows best.
Yeah, and it's funny that Lulu knew and she was horrified, terrified, and livid at the same time. And Jean Smart, thank you for being you, because that wasn't soapish. It was proper.
Like
acting.
it was just a beauty to behold, like the subtlety of her expression that read everything. It was like, oh, I love it. I love it.
And also, don't forget, 5 minutes earlier, she was sweeping under the rug and flat out ignoring all the insults Joe was throwing at her. Like, oh, so, boss, do you have a deal? Whereas now it was like, where are you going to hang?
She could brush off everything else, but he found her weak spot because that's what he does.
I think this scene showed us that he is indeed interested in men, but also that he does things out of pure manipulation. Because when he leaves the house and you can see the mansion, you can see Travis looking out the window like, hand out, and Joe just gets in the car and ignores him. It's like, I'm done with you.
That whole outside scene with Boz and then like his refusal to talk about it, that like, and the way it's lit in that sort of sunset lighting outside, it just looks unlike anything else.
So I actually think the whole episode happens throughout one entire day.
Yeah, I think so.
Because I feel like that you had all these parallels, right? And Cameron was in the hotel and Joe was doing this. But to be honest with you, like, I think the reason it was done so sort of subtly in terms of not a big like, oh, I'm gonna gaze at him at dinner and try to find the connection. No, he went straight in, and I think the reason for that was so that we don't think only about whether Joe is interested in men and women, but we think about whether ethical lines are being crossed to undercut someone else, whether it's Lulu or Boss. And I feel like that's sort of the point, even though it was a bit convoluted like the rest of the episode.
Do you think it was also trying to draw a parallel between Joe and Cameron? So up until now, we've established that Cameron's sexuality is largely built around scratching an itch. Like I don't think you've watched Elementary, but there's one of the things about that is that, oh yeah, there you go. So Sherlock obviously sets up all these activities because he's like, oh well, I have sex and then I think more clearly. And Cameron's following the Sherlock line, right?
And some of the characters coming out of the brownstone.
Absolutely, she is just scratching an itch and she's done. And I wondered if it was trying to draw a behavioral parallel between Cameron and Joe, which is that both of them are prepared to separate that part of their lives and to use it in ways that benefit them. So not in a sort of old-fashioned, I'm using it to get money or my rent paid, but in a, which, you got to do what you got to do. But it's more like I'm using it to win an intellectual argument, or I'm using it to, like, when she first slept with Joe, there was that really heavy-handed, like, not heavy-handed actually, it was that really kind of like cringeworthy moment where Joe is like, this isn't why I'm giving you the job kind of thing. And it's like icky, and you're like, but that Cameron never went into that to do that. That wasn't what she was trying to get out of that. She was going through a purely physical process. And later when she turns to him, it's, I'm trying to unlock something in my mind that is trapped at the moment. And I don't know, I guess it kind of makes Joe and Cameron much more similar than they have been up until now, because they've got such different aims for their lives. They've got such different ambitions, but they're both big picture thinkers to some extent. And they are both able to separate emotional, physical, intellectual, and compartmentalize them, like almost in an unhealthy way.
They're very driven. And when you're that driven, you sort of know what things, when and how, right? It's like and spotting those opportunities. And you're right. I feel like this is something that hopefully will be explored throughout the season. But again, I kind of like that it was done this way, so that it wasn't really also that shocking because of the context, right? Because it wasn't just this sort of like, I'm going into some dark alley to find a random young boy just because I want to scratch that itch. It wasn't that.
Yeah, and Travis isn't like
it was unethical.
Travis isn't like some like 19-year-old idiot. Like, he's a proper grown man making his own decisions. It's not. There's nothing kind of like.
Well, making some decisions.
There are no kind of like straight people imagining gay relationships, so overtones to the way that it's written. And I don't know anything about Jason Cahill's orientation, just to make that clear. It's just sometimes you get that in shows where you get like people mapping their ideas of what gays are like onto the story, and I don't think we get that here, thank God. And Travis is like, he knows what he's doing. Like, he's given his own little bit of agency, and you can tell he walks back into this room like making absolutely no effort to hide from Lulu whatsoever, because he just like, Joe's just unlocked something that makes him go, meh, and shrug and just let him go with it. It's brilliant.
I think the fact that Joe gets probably more pleasure out of being a manipulation play than an actual sort of sexual act does help continue developing his character, because, and we talk about this a lot, we touched on it in previous episodes, right, where we don't want like sexuality and gender to define the characters. Like, we know Cameron is a woman and Don is a woman in that context, and both in front and behind the camera. So I do kind of like that it was done out of that need to undercut the competition, rather than to it be like, oh, Joe's gay, so look, here's another dimension or bisexual, here's another dimension that we're adding. So I do kind of like that approach. Now, one really weird thing, actually, this is where, for me, things got really weird, and it might be minor to most of you, but when I was watching this, and the scene right before we go to Lulu's house is Joe staring at the computer, and it just cuts to like a similar shot of him in that house. I was like, wait, we told everyone that the show doesn't really do flashbacks, and like, it felt so odd that
I mean,
it felt so out of place with not only the pace, but just I thought it was a failed execution. And again, I don't think it's down to just one element whether it's directing, writing, or anything else. But that to me really showed how sort of patchy the episode was and
it
messy.
was an odd transition for the show. I did notice it, but I noticed it, I think, for the right reasons in terms of like from a filmmaking perspective, in that I noticed that, he looked cranky and peeved, and then he looks up and he paints his smile on, right? He paints on his charming face. And clearly that's what that scene was trying to do, was to say Joe can put on an act, and here he is putting on the act. I don't know whether that needed to be emphasized, because we've seen it so many times that I didn't feel like it was something that needed to be it was stylistically very different from most of the transitions, because usually it's quite blunt. Usually we sharply cut from one thing to another, and there's no real like weird
it felt really jarring to me. And that, I completely take your point around whether that was to draw those parallels between the different sides of Joe. But again, you could have been cutting it into him laughing and off camera, and then being like, oh wait, what's Joe doing there laughing when he was just cranky or whatever.
Yeah, there are definitely other ways that could have happened. And of all, like, obviously, like every episode of *Halt and Catch Fire*, there's a hefty bucket load of symbolism thrown into this one. That I would agree just didn't feel necessary, didn't feel particularly smooth. There was a kind of parallel one that I was heavy-handed, but I liked it, was Cameron looking into her screen, and you see the reflection of Cameron in the screen, and she types "not good enough." And I mean, you can't get any more like unsubtle, but I really liked it. And I thought that it fitted with everything we've seen in the show so far.
I liked it because I don't know if you've seen One Tree Hill, because it's not really your generation. It was more my generation. Or did you catch some of it?
Yeah, I think I'm in the 10 years that missed it. Sorry.
No, I mean, you're fine. We'll let it slide. But there was that's the next one. You're gonna have to binge watch 9 seasons of.
Absolutely.
You had the scene of Brooke Davis, a kind of iconic scene of a not good enough written on lipstick in front of a mirror, right? Very girly, very high schooly. So I do like how this is done, because it really is within the context of the show and what Cameron's trying to do. And we know that she's sort of more, even though she puts up a good front, we know she's more insecure than confident, because she can't figure this out. And she admits to Joe, I'm stuck.
Yeah, she's frustrated, and we know that. And she's potentially living in the office, and also is like a little bit tone deaf to everyone else's concerns. So when she literally starts pilfering things off people's desks before they're even out the building, and the engineer calls her on it, and she's like, oh yeah, okay, whatever, and just carries on, oblivious.
Hold on, that's another symbol there. Can we talk about the shoes? Because Boss actually mentions that he's like, you're walking, and this is so. I think there's two things here, because I thought that was really interesting. Boss didn't just say, oh, those are somebody else's shoes. He said, no, these are Frank's shoes.
So he literally says to her, basically, those are dead men's shoes. Like, he spells it out, and he doesn't flinch. And it's interesting, because so many people either treat Cameron as antagonistic or as a lackey, like, do the thing. Why aren't you doing it? As a child. And Boz is just like, I don't know. He kind of talks to her like she should know better, like she's old enough to know better, and why doesn't she know better? Which is it's still paternalistic in its way, but it's slightly different to how everybody else has responded to her so far.
They had a really nice scene, didn't they, when she's waltzing into his office and he's there trying to actually learn, sort of code and what they're doing, and she kind of respects on this it.
She respects it and says, "Well, it's hard at the beginning."
The last episode when she's talking to Debbie, remember about like, can I write letters to my boyfriend? And Cameron's like, yes, you'll be able to, and she doesn't treat her like an idiot.
Because if people admit what they don't know, Cameron's completely fine with it. Like, she's like, yeah, okay, you don't know, I can teach you. Whereas if people like Joe try to overstep the bounds and claim to know more than they really do, she's very disparaging very quickly. And so it's interesting that Boz is like the most senior person in Cardiff Electric. She should be showing the most deference to him. She shows deference to no one. So she wanders into his office, never
Yeah.
apologizes, doesn't care.
Yeah.
But she does respect that he's not trying to tell her how to do things. He's just trying to understand them, and she gets that. Like, it's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and I think is the dead man's shoes thing like a warning? Like you're taking someone's shoes that you got big shoes to fill or something. I don't know. I mean, I think that was one of those moments, and the big symbolism moment. While we're continuing to talk about some of the ones that we picked out, it's obviously the bird, right?
The bird.
The episode does every episode does sort of start and end with more so this one than the ones we've seen in the past, like start and end with this sort of cycle of we get up in the morning, we go to sleep at night, and the bird is sort of there in the beginning and the end. What's with the bird? This is the second animal we kill in an opening scene.
That is true. They're like pretty deadly, and like I feel like that's a motif that's going to carry on. So the bird is clearly there in a sort of, I don't know. Okay, so the bird is clearly there at Donna and Gordon's house because it feels like, although it could apply to other relationships that are happening and unwinding and other power plays and pissing contests that are going on here, the whole episode begins and ends with power plays between Donna and Gordon. And at the beginning, she just doesn't have time to deal with this shit, and neither does he. And then by the end, he's had whatever kind of metamorphosis has gone on for him during the course of the episode. And we'll go back to him in a minute, because like you said, you felt like this was a Gordon episode, and I want to hear more about what you thought about that.
Sure.
But then, of course, you have Donna stepping in at the end with the shovel, which is, just in case no one noticed, actually marked High Plains Hardware, and goes outside, and the whole episode ends with her like putting this bird out of its misery. And it's interesting because Donna's had a whole episode, as we just discussed, where she doesn't seem to be able to win any fight. Her mother is kind of slightly undermining her feelings about her marriage. Her boss is slightly undermining her feelings about her work.
They're fights that she doesn't want to fight anyway. No. They're not things that she's just thrown into situations and she can't win one way or another.
But the whole episode, things have been slowly being pulled out from under her, right? So at the beginning, she's just trying to get her life in order, and Gordon won't help. And then she's trying to get her work in order, and Hunt's kind of like putting pressure on her. And then she's trying to get her home life in order, and her mother is like, "Oh, couldn't your life have been better if you weren't with Gordon?" And then finally, she's the one that has to pick up the shovel and be like, whatever, and go for it. And that feels like they're trying to say, don't count Donna out. Like, when it matters, she's going to step up. So I'm now immediately interested to see what happens with her next. But it also kind of says something about Gordon, because at the beginning of the episode, Gordon's like poking at it, and he doesn't, you can tell he's a bit squeamish about the whole thing. And he's like, it's still alive. We should call the vet. We should try and resuscitate it. We should try and save it. He's a little bit like that. And then he gets to work and he can't really fire anybody. They don't even know they're being fired. Wait, what? And he's a bit rubbish, and then he has this accident, fires somebody. But even after that, even when he comes in bloodied, kind of puts his foot down with Donna about, I'm going to go kiss the girls and have a shower and blah blah blah, he still can't kill the damn thing. He still can't get out there and actually deal with things.
And actually, the first thing that stood out to me when Gordon is when Donna's like, come on, we have to take the girls, like, we don't have time for this, was like the tone deafness of Gordon always prioritizing the wrong thing and thinking, hold on, I'm going to put everything on hold. Like, I got a massive project to like save this random bird. And
it's not like it's a pet or anything. It's just a random bird, right? Like, I'm not imagining it.
And it's like, oh, the girls, what are they going to think, whatever. And I don't know. It was such a Gordon thing. And let's jump into Gordon, because I do like that this sort of micro conflict in a way was, even though it's not an episode conflict, it's just there to disguise more character development. But he, in the end, does end up firing this neighbor, this Brian guy. And I love that, because he was being manipulated by this guy who was not only sort of manipulating him from a point of view of power, going back to your point from when we started talking today about the dynamics, but from such a narrow-minded uh, point of ignorance. It was like, May, like, great idea, but how are we gonna pull that off? Like, he wants it easy. He wants to just, I'll take you to work. Like, don't worry, let the guys go early. Like, he thinks he's doing him a favor by sort of transferring those inefficiencies that probably have kept people like him in the same position throughout this tenure at Cardiff
Like,
Electric.
there's a revolution happening around this guy, and he's like, but what if we just did everything the way we always did?
What happens when Joe isn't supervising? Because did they even interact in this episode? I don't think so.
No.
Gordon almost went into the office and he didn't.
Yes, so we'll come back to that in a second, because Joe is clearly building some walls around himself there. And the fact that Gordon sort of lingers outside the door, and then the secretary says, you can go in, it's fine, like giving him permission to go and speak to the guy who up until now he's been hanging out in a garage building things with. He's been having to and fro, but he's always, he was in the boardroom with Joe when the whole IBM thing kicked off. Like, he's been on not an equal footing, because Joe has consistently held him in his place, but he's at least been present, and now he can't even get in the same room.
Sure.
So
no, and again, what happens when I did love the firing scene, because it was kind of like classic Gordon. You can't do anything by yourself, and you're not. When he was telling this story, again, more symbolism, right? Like, imagine if when it snows too early, you're still a unique snowflake. It was kind of like when you get U.S. shows from like the 90s, and they mocked like going to a clinic and getting like, which pamphlet do you want, like the abortion one, the keeping your baby, the adopting it. It was kind of like those pre-written classic 80s
it's like a script
problem lines,
but a really badly awkwardly written one, because Gordon cannot communicate.
And he did say, like, I'm not qualified for this, and you sort of wonder, like, well, very similar to what we saw with Cameron last episode, where she was stepping up to the plate in ways that she didn't really know she had to, in terms of fulfilling something that she's being paid to do. It was the same with Gordon. It's like, what did you think? You were going to continue building stuff in your garage without the added responsibility of the corporate world forcing you to make all these decisions? And actually, they did interact. Sorry, Joe and Gordon did interact when they are trying to do something, and I think Joe is explaining to everyone in the room.
That's right.
And Gordon's like, and he's like, "Can we go outside for a second?" As if Joe set everything up for everyone, and it's just like, Gordon, fix this. What's going on? And he did the same with the binder from last episode. So it's so interesting to see how Joe is able to just delegate blindly to these people, and then come back and expect that. So where are you at with this? The classic line of upper management, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then to kind of square that whole circle, and we know that at the end of the episode now, we know that she's going to undercut the whole thing by literally wandering into his house and taking her top off, because she's stuck and that it suits her. But when Cameron first tries to get hold of Joe, because she's feeling a little bit confused about things, she gets the secretary, and it's like, oh, Mr. McMillan's office, and everyone is being cut off. It's not just that he's distancing himself from Gordon, who he thinks of as a little bit of a lackey. You can see in the way that he uses him sometimes. He's cutting himself off from Cameron as well, like from everyone in the office, even to some extent from Boz. When those negotiations happen, they have to happen in Boz's office, because Boz is at the top of the tree. But then Joe retreats to his own little den to kind of plan and strategize and all the rest of it. And that's where you see his kind of true face before he goes to the meeting with Lulu, in that slightly dodgy transition. And I do kind of love that Cameron is like, oh, I can't get to you at work? Well, I'll turn up to your house. To her, it's just a different route to the same endpoint. I love that.
Because she does call him as well, right? She does call him, and Debbie picks up, and he's like, yeah, did you call me?
Yeah, but when he calls back, she is now not in the mood to speak to him. And that constant power play dynamic but that's been running. That's not just in this episode about power plays. That's been running from the very first interaction that they had. So that's really lovely and consistent.
One of the reasons why the episode felt really jarring to me and sort of average is because, and I mentioned this in the beginning, we are introduced to two elements. We're introduced to like all these different characters that actually, to an extent, form part of people's lives. Like, you have Brian the neighbor, who actually is kind of like that B actor just standing there for the sake of saying a couple of lines, and the woodpecker on Gordon's head. But then you also have like Donna's mother and her boss and Lulu, etc. Right? So characters that would potentially move the narrative forward. Now, the introductions we said felt rushed, which I think rings true. But also, it's kind of the first episode where everyone branches out in their own bubble, and this is what happens when you don't get that interaction between them and that dynamic in the office, which I think we do get back to, obviously, throughout the rest of the season. But it felt even more jarring for those that were stepping way beyond Cardiff Electric, and I mean Cameron, for example, those random punks that she finds outside of the convenience store. I thought it was so cliched, and again, reminded why I didn't like Cameron in the sort of first season, because it's kind of like you're kind of punkish, you're kind of sort of indie alternative punk, and then you see these random people, and you're gonna go into a hotel room with them and just dance and do drugs and get knife tattooed.
She's kind of bratty, and you don't know yet whether that's justified or not, because you don't know enough about her yet. And for someone like, there are bratty characters where you're like, actually, to use the Sherlock analogy again, we give him a pass ish for being a brat because we know that he's got a mega brain, right? And we know Cameron thinks she has a mega brain.
She's brilliant.
We know she thinks she's brilliant, but she hasn't actually achieved anything yet. So she hasn't actually completed the BIOS. We know that she's got the potential to do
it. She's not earned it.
But she hasn't earned the right to be quite as snotty as she's being just yet.
And we know Joe has to an extent.
Yeah, and we also know that she's a young woman, so it's going to take 3 times as much for her to earn the respect as it would, which is not fair, but we know that that's the reality of this time and this place and this job. So,
and I wonder how much she's going to actually take some of the advice, because when boss was telling her, you gotta, keep things in line, you gotta, look after yourself, etc.
He effectively tells her
condescending. He was
that she hasn't earned it yet. Like, he's like, you're stepping straight into someone else's shoes.
But is she gonna learn? Is she gonna? I don't know if she's gonna take that, and I don't know if that's gonna make her sort of, where that's gonna put her again. Going back to the shoes and the bird, where that's gonna put her, and what that's going to do for the rest of the dynamic. So, just to wrap things up in terms of both the story and the episode, another thing that happened off camera was the score really coming in through and giving and sort of marking more of an identity for the show. And I'm not just talking about the music, which obviously the soundtrack continues to be awesome, I think. And interestingly enough, a lot of the soundtrack is coming out of Cameron, is coming out of what she's listening to and what she's feeling at the moment.
It is. There's one needle drop that is actually a really well-known track. Like, we talked in the first 2 episodes about how they didn't use the obvious 80s tracks, but we have a Gary Newman moment that comes in here where they just go straight into an incredibly well-known 80s song and then cut it off very sharply as well. So it's like you just get this tiny little hint of, I don't know if it's like we had a bit more budget this episode, or whether it was just too perfect to underscore the moment and they just felt that it was exactly right for this moment. I'd like to think it was a bit of both.
Yeah, and it was also the only track. So I think a lot of the times that you sort of hold on to that budget for the one track that's really going to allow you to sort of speak to that message. But the score, which we talked about, which we covered in the last episode, which is quite cinematic and really lets the scenes breathe, especially in this sort of jarring pace that we had, I thought really came in at the right time, because it wasn't built on existing soundtracks, whether they're known tracks or not, but rather something that was built for the show and play for those scenes. And we do hear again coming in through some of the other episodes. And another thing that I noticed in relation to the soundtrack and the score, and maybe this is like like a little dropping a fact that it's a different director and a different writer. But the intro song actually starts with a different beat in the beginning. It kind
Yes.
of falls through a different score playing through that scene, and then it goes in. It just blends
I
in.
honestly had a moment where I was like, did I remember that wrong? But then I thought, no, that is definitely from the
No,
cold open into the opening credits, there's just this transition that I hadn't heard before.
no, and the cold open is actually taking longer duration wise than in previous episodes, which means again they're really playing around with um, the structure of the narrative, right? They're still finding ways around it, and it's really interesting. Again, as we do the research for this episode, that it's actually because of the change behind the camera and direction, rather than which is part of the experimentation, right? Um, so I thought the soundtrack really, for me, helped drive the episode along. Maybe where the editing really didn't do it justice from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think I liked this episode a bit more than you. I liked some of the power plays and some of the things. I feel like it tried to do too much, and therefore, for you, I think the overall feeling just didn't live up to expectations, which I would agree with. We do know that we're going to go on to a different writer and a different director in the next episode again. So this is the point I think at which things really don't go in terms of the writing. I don't think things go back into the hands of the creators until towards the end of this season now. So we're going to see a regular turnover, and it'd be really interesting because, like we said right at the beginning when we're talking about the pilot, this feels like an immensely well planned show for the most part. Like we
Yeah.
know that things are going to unravel in a way that is, there's great character building and consistency and all those kinds of things. Those are the things that kept us hooked. We also know that season 1 is the least tight of all the sort of seasons to come, and it's the one that lost the most people, right? This is the one that if people
And I can see why this episode would have lost a lot of people as well,
Yeah.
because it didn't end with you thinking, shit, I can't wait to watch the next one because something. No, it's sort of like wrapped in its own package, and you're like, I can't keep track with what's going on in the actual building of the computer.
Yes.
And I can't care about it enough.
Yeah. There's not quite enough tension there just yet. I have questions for sure, but
yeah, but it's like, is it not going to happen because we're not getting investment, or how is Lulu going to interject with the plans? And it's kind of like, unless you're interested in understanding how they're going to build a computer, how they're going to build a thing, it's not actually very interesting. And we already know that the most interesting thing, and the thing that kept coming, that we kept coming back to, were the characters. So when you have an episode that actually doesn't really focus on the characters together, I can totally understand why someone might have lost interest watching this one.
And that's, I think, what we need to look for in the next episode is that one the one that then brought things back together again? And those are my big questions for kind of episode 4 and beyond. Is are we going to get these people all back in a room, or are we still going to have Gordon dancing around the edges of Joe and not interacting? Because some of their interactions are some of the best bits of the show, and I really want that back. How is Cameron? Cameron is still, like, she's much better developed than she was in the first episode. We know much more about her. She's been given much more room to breathe, but she's still, her only way into this world is still through Joe. She's still kind of on the periphery. She's had this one meeting with Donna that didn't really go anywhere. She's had these interactions with Gordon where even the plot of the show is keeping them as separate as possible. How else is she gonna
the soda situation?
Yeah, the soda situation. Which, I mean, I just love that line because it's so Gordon to kind of come to the end of something and realize that the other person wasn't even playing.
But that's another one where the camera was fixed and Cameron came in and really just followed Cameron, and that was very subtle. The camera could have moved more than 40 degrees, but it didn't matter.
No.
It was just that her breaking into that conversation between the other two. No, I agree. I feel like it's going to be really interesting to see how the characters could sort of come together, and I'm particularly interested in understanding how Donna is going to, like, how that her work side of things at TI is going to develop further. Like, do we think that her helping Gordon figure out this physics problem is going to be an issue going forward. And
Absolutely.
is that a conflict of interest?
I mean, I feel like you don't set up a whole scene at TI and hire Scott Michael Foster to deliver it without that. Like, you're pretty much saying we want this to go somewhere. And obviously then they had the underscoring from her mother where it's like, oh, look at this past relationship. Let us just dig into that a little bit further and suggest that there might have been a romantic entangling as well. So
that's the thing. Like, is it going to be the romantic side of it? Is it going to be the actually Donna is really underrated, so she'll make a jump to Cardiff, and then how is that husband and wife dynamic going to play out? Or is it going to be Ti wants to develop something, Donna has the brains for it. Let's set up a different type of dynamic. It could be all three.
Yeah, is it going to be a competitor dynamic? Like they're not computers, but could they be doing something interesting that puts them on a collision course?
Well, really, really interesting was when we start figuring out Donna's true sort of smarts when she goes, I've been debugging this, and actually, if we redesign this bit in the keyboard, we can be more efficient. And he goes, oh, Donna, that's not our purview. That's not what we do. And it's just kind of like, but and then she can't help herself, and Gordon knows this when she's looking over his shoulder on what he's working on, because at work, not only is she not being heard or properly utilized, she's in a department that doesn't really care whether something is failing or not. It's just kind of like, that's not your problem, so don't fix it. And
no, she's not fulfilled.
No, and we continue to dive into sort of the corporate structure of where you belong or where you don't, and actually Joe coming in to disrupt things hopefully shows you a different side of that dynamic, and how we evolve the corporate tech world into open plan offices and glass see-through offices and transparency. I don't know. I feel like that's actually another sort of underlying tone for the show in its parallels to reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's, like you say, I totally understand why this episode in its kind of closedness might have put people off. But certainly were the first time around enough questions to keep me watching. And yeah, I did have the benefit of somebody who was recommending it going, oh, by the way, it's going to get a whole lot better as you go along. And hopefully we're doing that here.
Yes.
We're just telling you outright. Keep watching. But
we just launched the first episode, and obviously by the time that you're hearing this, it's going to be episode 1, 2, and 3. And so many people have told that are close to me who have been recommending this for so long are telling me, now I'm going to watch it. I really want to get back into it. Just listening to it, it's going to be great. I'm really pumped for it. So here's hoping that you continue to stick with it and with us.
Yeah, honestly, if we achieve nothing else but getting another 5 people to watch it so that we can talk about it off air, then we will be happy people. So somebody watch it, talk to us about it. Ask us questions, or ask questions that came up that we haven't talked about, or things that we didn't notice, because that kind of stuff makes us very happy. So on that note, that is it, I think, for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. We will be back next week to get stuck into episode 4, Close to the Metal. So in the meantime, please come and join us on Twitter at TTG. Sorry, not TTG. That's Teen Titans Go. Join us at TTT. Think about it. And please share your thoughts, questions, and comments. We'd love to see you there.
Even better, subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app of choice, and you'll never miss an episode. And we won't feel like a dead bird.